Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and professional growth and opportunity across America. Hello everybody, thanks for joining us today. Welcome to another episode of the Ameritocracy Show. In today's episode, we're resuming our series on building a nation. We'll be examining the life of John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller lived a full life of contradictions. He was known as a ruthless businessman and a strategist who built and eliminated competition and built a monopoly in the oil industry. In contrast, he was also a generous philanthropist dedicated to funding charitable causes, championing medical research, education, and international development. If you're interested in a more in-depth look at Rockefeller's life, I would recommend one of my favorite authors, Ron Chernow's book, Tycoon, The Life of John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller was born in 1939 to a working-class family in rural upstate New York. He was raised by a stable religious mother named Eliza and a tough, imperfect father named William, who really impressed hard work and eventual estrangement onto John. Interestingly, his father, William, spent a lot of time away from home and was known as a traveling con man, or what we would call today a snake oil salesman, spending just a lot of time on the road with the family, not really knowing where he was at and what his life outside of the family was really built around. At age 14, his family moved to Cleveland, where he went to finish high school, and then he attended Folsom Commercial College, where he studied bookkeeping. What I found interesting and noted in my research of him is that that time, as a young man, literally in his 20s, he was described as somebody that was reserved, earnest, religious, methodical, and discreet. He declared openly as a youth that his two great ambitions were to make $100,000, which at that time was about the equivalent of about $3.2 million, and to live to be 100 years old. After he finished his time at college, he started as a bookkeeper in a produce distribution business, and then eventually that business started getting into petroleum distribution. And there, very soon after, as the business was growing, they started reading stories of oil reserves that were discovered in Oil Creek, Pennsylvania. And a lot of people were trying to figure out what that new industry would be. And since they were actually dealing in petroleum products, they were really kind of sitting there trying to figure out, should they make further investments and get involved in it, which they eventually did. A year before the Civil War, he started his first business in Cleveland. In the U.S., corporations were formed and confined to actually operate in states, specific states. Companies that desire to do business in multiple states would also have to incorporate in those states. And that really made really tough if you were doing had a company that was actually trying to do interstate business. But as his business grew, the number of businesses grew. During the Civil War, very similar to like J.P. Morgan, which we talked about in one of our other episodes, Rockefeller hired a substitute soldier to serve in his place, and while he ran his business, and through that process, he significantly profited off of the war. Today, you would kind of look at this process as a lot of the corporations, what they call the military-industrial complex, that are kind of sitting on the periphery, that definitely have a component of their livelihood dependent on what happens within the military operations. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870, and at that point, he was 31 years old, and he directly ran it till about 1897 at age 58. One of the key strategies that Rockefeller implied through Standard Oil was vertical integration. And during this period, Rockefeller really led Standard Oil through a bunch of significant growth through what the vertical integration that we've talked about before on the show. And specifically, the vertical integration would be, if you look at the oil industry, there would be a bunch of different parts of the oil market. There's the part where there's oil in the ground. There's then the part to extract the oil, and those are the oil producers. Once the oil is taken out of the ground, it's got to be moved and stored to then be sent to a refiner. This is where Standard Oil would pick up and be the refinery. Once the oil is refined and turned into different products, the oil would then be sent out for distribution. So that oil distribution is a different business. And then once it was out there, the prices that people would pay at the end product really could be controlled by where and when the oil was distributed. And so those types of vertical integration of the supply chain for what Rockefeller was doing was he was able to kind of then very slowly grab control of each part of the vertical integration. And after 1870, as the company began to grow, one of the key products that was being used, because if you remember, in the 1870s was before automobiles. So a lot of people think the oil industry, that Rockefeller was making oil for gasoline, but it was actually kerosene was a big product. And kerosene was used for lighting across the nation. And as cities were starting to grow, especially in metropolitan areas, kerosene ended up being a really important product that needed to get distributed. And it was before the time of electricity with Thomas Edison. So, and probably the other byproduct that was used within the oil industry was use the oil for lubricants for machinery, specifically like the railroads. And so as the railroad and the start of the industrial era took off, 1870s to the 1900s, you could see a tremendous amount of use for oil as an input product for what was going on during that period. The oil refinement, oil distribution business allowed Standard Oil to really control the oil producers. Like I said, in the supply chain, the people that had stakes to actual physical land and were trying to get oil out of the ground, basically Rockefeller could refuse to take the oil, and then they would end up, once the oil is tapped and it starts producing, they have to get that oil either stored or it goes to waste. And so fairly quickly, he could set a price that he would be willing to take the oil off their hands. And so at a very quick pace there, the oil producers would really kind of be at his mercy. And then as you kind of move up, once he started working to refine the oils had to be moved as refined product through the railroads. He got involved in specializing very specific tanker cars, or cars that would be where oil used to be moved from place to place in barrels. And the barrels would have leaks, and that leakage would always be anticipated as potential loss. Now this oil could be moved directly from a refinery into a tanker car and then moved to the distribution hubs, either internally within the United States or to the ports, and be sent overseas, where he also dominated the foreign oil import and exports. As Standard Oil got bigger, after about 20 years into his business after starting in 1870, the government started getting involved and started looking at, specifically they're looking at consumer price issues and trying to see, is the consumer of oil on the back end paying the right prices for oil, especially if you've got one company that's controlling all aspects of the vertical integration of that market. In 1890, the political establishment and a lot of people in America has really started focusing on that they need to have laws passed to try to help standardize or control these big companies. We've talked about this around with J.P. Morgan and banking. We've talked about it in different types of industries, Carnegie, steel, Vanderbilt for railroads. So there was a lot of concern about antitrust or monopolies. So in 1890, they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was an important part of legislature that basically put these big companies on notice. So at that point, what ended up happening is Rockefeller really started to focus on the political side of his business, trying to make sure that he built alliances with at the highest levels of government, including the presidents. Around 1898, They had a presidential race, and they had industry had gotten behind a person, William McKinley. He was supposed to be a pro-trust guy. And when I say trust, so when I talked about before that the companies could basically only do business in each state, one of the innovations that came across that really Rockefeller helped form around Standard Oil was to create what they called a trust. And the trust allowed a roll-up of all the companies into kind of a holding company. And so basically within a state, you could have an Ohio Standard of Ohio company. And then at the highest level, you'd have the Standard Oil Trust. And that trust could then basically be at arm's length to all the operations that's happening. So that seemed to be a really tough thing to regulate from a federal government perspective. And so when they got behind William McKinley, he was a pro-trust presidential candidate. They thought that they had really won. And so in 1898, after 8 years of the Sherman Act, they thought, this could be the beginning of them reshaping the government. And unfortunately for them, 1901, William McKinley was assassinated. And at that point, Teddy Roosevelt ended up becoming the president of the United States, and he was the complete opposite. So Teddy Roosevelt, in 1901, as he assumed, he basically looked at trusts in two ways. He said there's two types of trusts. There's good ones that really bring market stability and fit the national purpose of or there's malevolent ones that are really unfairly fix prices and harm the consumers. And he clearly thought that Standard Oil was in the latter. And at this point, not only was Standard Oil trying to work through the politics of the business, but they were also starting to become a significant target in the press. And at this point, again, what's helpful for the story on Rockefeller is the maturity of corporations using the ability to manage their public relations, to look at their corporate media, to offset or evaluate the power of investigative reporting that basically goes in to really kind of slow things down and takes information to the public, which then generates public sentiment and policy. So Rockefeller really looked at this, and he had, two philosophies. In the beginning, he really had no interest in trying to engage the media. His perspective, his first philosophy was just don't engage. He would tell people, look, if we're right, over time, the correction will come. And if we're wrong, then we haven't given them any fanfare or any extra focus. So it's kind of a weighted out strategy. At that point, after the Sherman Act and as they started to deal with Teddy Roosevelt, they really started to focus on establishing public relations and hiring PR professionals. And at that point, they would hire people that were journalists, usually at newspapers, that were really trying to show companies how to engage the media, how to generate stories and public interests that are positive about the company. And, so if another part to look at as we're building a nation is the way corporations use these media relations. And you see a lot of that today. Probably one of the biggest things, though, that became kind of a flashpoint for Rockefeller was one specific reporter that really went to task on Rockefeller, went to task on Standard Oil. And at that point, what President Roosevelt called a muckraker was Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell was a journalist that really made it her life's passion to come after Standard Oil and publish what she published in 1904 called The History of the Standard Oil Company. And basically her focus was to expose corruption in the business and to try to exploit that to bring public sentiment and pressure, again, to break up these big companies, that the Sherman Act didn't go far enough. So Ida made it clear as she went and she published this 19-part expose of Standard Oil and Rockefeller's real brutal business practices that had destroyed her father's oil business, as well as many other oil-related companies in Pennsylvania's oil region in the 1870s. So this is something that she had been harboring for over 30 years. At that point, 1904, it was considered one of the most influential books on business ever. And published in the United States, and even by several historians that have taken a look at it post-fact. But really what that did is it brought every aspect of Standard Oil. It talked about its early history. It made connections between Rockefeller, like in the early period, and Standard Oil, moving from state to state, how he took over in each state, basically bought out all the refineries and then started to control the oil producers piece by piece, bought large shares into railroads, controlled the distribution of the oil market. And through that illumination of what Ida had done and the focus on Standard Oil and Rockefeller, in 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court actually found that Standard Oil had originated monopoly practices. And at that point, they ordered the company to be broken up into 34 new companies. These are companies that you would hear of today. So, Standard Oil, obviously, you've probably heard of, but companies that today were broken up or that became of the 34 would be companies like Chevron, Conoco, Exxon, Mobil, many others. At the time of the breakup, Standard Oil controlled about 70% of the market share for the refined oil market. And because Rockefeller had 25% share ownership in Standard Oil, when the court ordered the breakup of the company into 34 companies, he basically got a commensurate amount of ownership now in 34 companies. So I don't think it was the intended consequence of basically the breaking up of the monopoly, but at that point, it basically exponentially increased Rockefeller's wealth, as he now had 25% share in 34 companies that were growing rapidly. So his wealth was also growing very rapidly. And at the highest point for John D. Rockefeller, just to put it in perspective, is that he was worth probably over about $400 billion in today's dollars at that point. So, if you think about it, Rockefeller, the time period 1911 when this company gets broken up, I said that he had worked up to a point and then was basically just a shareholder, but he was also starting to take on a lot of different things outside of Standard Oil. And as he started to accumulate wealth, he also was really trying to increase his reach into philanthropy. And one of the things is that, maybe a hard problem, or an interesting problem to have is I think he was generating wealth at such a pace that he was really finding it hard to figure out how to distribute that back into philanthropies and things that he cared about. So when we start looking at Rockefeller's involvement in philanthropy, it's kind of interesting to start looking at his philosophy and kind of what he was trying to do. And his big philosophy when he started to really distribute a lot of money, and over his lifetime, he distributed about $530 million in those day dollars into philanthropies. He would try to square his philanthropy with self-reliance. So he looked at the biggest problem that he was concerned about would be he didn't want to promote dependency. To give you kind of an example of real life today, like somebody donates money to a university to establish a new school of medicine. They say they donate the money to establish and build a hospital. He wanted to establish the structure and the way to be able to deliver that capability to the university, but he didn't want to be the person making the annual amount to have to make sure that the bills were paid year in year. So what he wanted the school to do is once they made that investment, he wanted them to take on the fundraising that would be required to maintain and operate these operations, so that, again, that there wasn't this dependency or self-reliance on him as the donor, the single donor. He also felt that it was just really important that to contribute to education, medical research. He felt that it really strengthened the recipients, made them better prepared for the evolutionary struggles, that get them ready to compete and to not tamper with outcomes. So as he would go through, he always looked at his focus was to remove the causes for unequal outcomes in the end. As he, was now taking his wealth and really starting to change his focus from being the person that really drove Standard Oil. You can start to look at, even in his story, that we won't cover so much today, but like his oldest son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., got involved and went with the business. But at this point, Rockefeller, really to stay focused on him, was really very similar to J.P. Morgan at this point in his life. He was a hero and he was a villain. He was a hero because, like we said, some of the benefits of having a company come in and start to establish a market, that we actually start to see stability in the market and predictable prices. Even if the prices are harmful, at least you know where they are, so you can plan to build your business around that. But even regardless of the Ida Tarbell stories that were out there, the breakup of his empire, even to the end, he really loved America. His daughters, his son and his daughters that he had, one of his daughters actually had moved overseas. She had passed away, and her husband, Charles Strong, so his daughter Bessie, that was married to Charles Strong and they lived in Europe. When she came back, her body came back to be buried in the cemetery with the rest of the Rockefellers. I think there was a lot of press that were asking him at that point, with all of the problems that you've had in the U.S., the politicians, the presidents, the media, do you want to, don't you think it might be good just to go ahead and just take off and go over to Europe and like some of your family? And at this point, he was like, look, I'm committed to staying in the U.S. One of his quotes that he said is the United States can't develop enough drawbacks to conclude that there's no place like home. I just thought that was a very, very powerful quote. So closing thoughts on Rockefeller, when you look at kind of present modern day observations, probably 3 or 4 things. Number one, balancing the entrepreneurship and business principles. So, I think something we explore a lot on this show is, equal opportunities happen, but a lot of times, it really depends on hard work, focus, and really preparation. But you're never really guaranteed an equal outcome. And so, I think that, one of the things you learn from the Rockefeller story is that this guy basically scrapped his way from nothing and then ended up, being one of the most wealthiest people. But I also think, as he went through that, you really kind of look at, the principles and kind of how you carry yourself out there. In the end, philanthropy, his significant turn to philanthropy might have been an outlet to try to kind of square off some of the issues that Ida Tarbell had talked about in her biography, and some of the areas where he really, had some business practices that were really could be considered pretty scrupulous. When you look at the other parts of this price sensitivity and economic stability, like I was talking about earlier, is I think, if you look at oil, transport, the business input costs, all of these things are really important for whole industries or whole countries to be able to have some stability to build a foundation on. If you're in a country that doesn't have the set infrastructure and you've got prices all over the place, you don't really have the opportunity to create an environment for sustainable growth and potentially an environment to start growth or to start a new venture. So again, kind of looking at John D. Rockefeller as a hero and a villain, the price sensitivity and economic stability definitely was something that we look at in the context of his story. Another area that I think is interesting is an observation, and it's something we see today also, is in corporate structures, trusts, monopolies, and government involvement. And, very similar to even today, if you study like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, or you keep going back further, or even airplane building by the Wright brothers or the first flight, innovation was a big deal, and it continues to be a big deal today. And I think where Rockefeller's innovation was really kind of taking that corporate structure and that vertical integration and really showing how you can do that. And if you remember on one of our shows about a month or two ago with Dan Nelson from Hyundai, Hyundai Motors, which is a Korean-based automotive manufacturer and distributor of cars. We talk a little bit about how at all of the automotive companies, not only just Hyundai, but Toyota, Ford, all of them have this vertical integration. So integration and this innovation that was really kind of brought on by John D. Rockefeller, I think you see a lot of that today. Lastly, we take a look at philanthropy. So, and this is a common theme, again, that we saw with JP Morgan and a couple of the other folks that we're going to take a look at, is that, they get to a certain point as they're wealthy and they need to start focusing on creating their legacy and what I would call their redistribution of wealth. And that seems kind of harsh, but the reality is they start accumulating much more money than they'll ever need. Many people you hear today, Gates, you hear Bezos, you hear a lot of these wealthy billionaires that are they're making a public declaration that they're not going to be leaving their kids all this money, and that they want to basically redirect, the philanthropy and get the money back into the redistribution of the wealth to help out society. So, the thing with John D. Rockefeller is that, again, going back to what Ida Tarbell and, the publishment of kind of how Standard Oil was made, we can't make him a saint, but because he wasn't. But I think what philanthropy does is, kind of a way to kind of recalculate your value to society and really try to give back. Some would argue if it's too much or too little too late, but I think this is a cycle that we see a lot for very super uber successful people that we've been studying in the course of Ameritocracy. Well, that concludes our discussion today on John D. Rockefeller. I hope you really enjoyed that. In our comments, I'd be interested if you might want to give us some feedback on who you think we might want to explore in future episodes of Building a Nation. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I really look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you very much. Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.